Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Mark Michelli. I'm the Custom Content Editor for Government Executive Media Group. On behalf of Government Executive Media Group and CDW-G, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's viewcast, Innovating Government IT Procurement through JELA. This is the first of two viewcasts in which we'll explore DoD's Joint Information Environment strategy leading to procurement shifts. Before I introduce our guests here today, I have just a few brief announcements for the audience. At the end of the session, I'm going to turn the conversation over to the audience and ask questions that you've submitted to our panel. Please tweet those questions using the hashtag InnovatingGovernmentIT. That's going to be all one word. Again, that's InnovatingGovernmentIT. And you can send them at any point in today's program, and we'll be collecting them as we go and kind of submitting them as they come up. We also urge you to just join in on the conversation, even if you don't have a question, comment. Feel free to leave your thoughts, even if what you're sharing isn't necessarily a direct question. And tomorrow we'll be sending an email, and that link, we'll have a link in that email that will be to the recorded viewcast today, and it'll be available to watch for about the next 3 months. And without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to our guests and make a few quick introductions. Next to me is Frank Konechny. Frank is the Chief Technology Officer, Office of Information Dominance, and Chief Information Officer, Office of the Secretary of the Air Force. He has managed more than 20 significant government sector programs involving multiple large and small business subcontractors and academic institutions in areas of Army and Navy manpower, logistics, force structure, undersea warfare, real-time statistical analysis, biometric authentication, enterprise architecture, workflow management, and simulation and modeling. So Frank, with all that, we look forward to hearing about your experience with JELA. So thank you for joining us today. So next to Frank, we have Greg Reeder. And Greg is the Director of Adobe Strategic Programs at Caresoft Technology Corporation. One of his key roles is program management for distribution on the Adobe Joint Enterprise License Agreement. So Mr. Reeder's background spans nearly 30 years, leading in business, senior government management, and the military. He has experience as a government information officer, a software quality engineer, public affairs director, web developer, business executive, magazine publisher, helicopter pilot, and Marine Corps officer. So Greg, thank you very much for being here as well. And finally, we have Greg Yamor, and Greg is a senior manager for federal contract capture at CDW-G. Joe has been with CDW-G for 13 years, and in his last position was senior manager for Air Force, Navy, USMC, and DoD agencies with CDW-G. So Joe, thank you for being here as well.
Thanks, Mark.
So just to kind of give an overview of the conversation today, we kind of want to start off things broadly, looking at what the definition and history of JELA is. So giving kind of an intro to an overview of JELA. Moving on from there, kind of talking about the structure and strategy behind JELA in particular as relates to DoD's JIE. Finally, we'll move on to JELA in action, giving you some examples of how it's been used with some specific examples from some of our guests. And finally, look at the future of JELA as well as the what it kind of indicates for the procurement outlook going into 2015 and beyond. And then finally, we'll conclude with Q&A. So just to kind of kick things off, gentlemen, JELA represents a relatively new procurement approach for DoD. And before we explore the ins and outs too much, I just want to start at the beginning. So this question is just kind of for all three of you. What is JELA? What are its origins? And what does it enable procurement teams in DoD to do?
Yeah, I'll start. The JELA is really the joint level of the enterprise level agreements. The services have had enterprise level agreements for a long time already. And this is the viewpoint of DoD now to look at it from a holistic viewpoint. That's JIE. To look at it from the enterprise level. And so the joint enterprise level agreements are really enterprise agreements across all of the components within DoD. And that's mainly the change, because now instead of having Air Force negotiate a particular agreement or the Army negotiate a particular agreement, and they both negotiate agreements, and it comes out with different rate structures and different costing values evaluated with it, we now have a capability to look across all of DoD and look at it from a viewpoint of, holistically.
Yeah, and I think just to that point, if you look at it from the broader scale, that it helps across those agencies, within each one of those agencies. Before, on the Adobe JELA, for example, there was an estimated about 17,000 individual transactions every time someone bought software. Well, now there's one transaction. So just that reduction alone is several millions of dollars in overhead that's saved by having one common way to buy software, in addition to all the benefits of having common software across all those agencies. So in the case of that JELA, it's the Army, Air Force, and DISA that benefit from a common thread of software. Now that leads into the JIE, where you have interoperability, shareability, collaboration, and all the benefits that are intended by the Joint Information Environment you get by having the contract vehicle that provides it.
Yeah, and then just to add on to those points, I think that one of the biggest areas is leveraging the economies of scale within the different DoD components, so that as opposed to one specific branch or one specific agency negotiating an agreement, can leverage the full breadth of the DoD to drive down cost and save taxpayer money.
I mean, I have something else too. I mean, what happened was when we you don't realize that the Air Force is pretty big, and we have many MAJCOMs and units out there that are buying software. And so, for instance, and I don't know about it when we bought Adobe, but I'm sure we had like 2,000 contracts with the company that we're trying to figure out. We had different spans of duration, different licensing agreements, as well as different costs associated with it. So from the viewpoint of the enterprise, we like to have one contract, one pricing model. It saves us lots of time, lots of money, and it also saves the companies lots of money too, because they were also managing those 2,000 contracts.
Right.
Yep.
Can you, anyone kind of share the history of JELA? Does anyone know when it first came online, and what were some of the external and internal drivers that ultimately prompted the DoD to explore this route?
Well, the first JELA that we did in DoD was for Microsoft. And it was the obvious one that we all had different agreements. We all had different durations of time. We all had different product lines in the JELA that were our main product lines. And so the process was to go across and look at all the components. In this case, it was Army, Air Force, and DISA, and determine exactly what we wanted as a base footprint for our laptops and things, what we wanted for a base for our server farms. And that was a big effort because we all had different ideas what we wanted, which is not uncommon. Right. But so we all went and eventually got to the point where we said, this is what we all will have as a base contract piece. And that was the first time we ever got together to actually determine it. And we had, of course, issues with durations of contracts, because none of our contracts are actually ending at the same point in time. And so we had to work with the vendor community to actually say, okay, understand that we want to do this now, and we want to stop all our other contract work and continue with the new JELA at this point in time.
Now, can anyone elaborate on any, so that sounded like a lot of the internal drivers. What were some of the external drivers that you've seen in your experience that kind of prompted jumping on this method?
Money, budget cuts, the obvious ones. Mm-hmm. There's also a couple others too. I mean, the budget is obviously the main driver for most of this, because with sequestration and everything else occurring, the budget has been radically cut. And therefore, there had to be a way of looking at economies of scale across the board. But there's also another way of looking at this too. As we talk about going to the Joint Information Environment, we want to be able to move products across, or be able to have people in various components actually do things for other components. And so we want to be able to increase standardization across the board, so that when we go to a particular, in the JIE frame of reference, we would have an enterprise level operations center. We like to have Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force personnel all working in that center, and all have the same understanding and training for that particular pace. To do that, you have to have some semblance of standardization across the board. And therefore, when we move around and we get to cloud computing, we want to move things to a commercial cloud, for instance, we want to be able to have the ability to move those licenses as well. And that's been some of the drivers, is how are we going to work as an enterprise.
And I can add to that too. Just a couple of the other charges of the JIE is to partner with industry to be able to come up with solutions not only for security architecture, network sharing, collaboration, but also to keep up with the pace of technology. Because the demands are greater and greater every single day. People want more mobility, they want more sharing, they want more video, they want better ways to communicate. So having a contract in place that everybody is level set at the same time of renewal, the same way to get new products, adds to the ability to innovate and to keep up with technology. And so that's the benefit of having everybody in one common thread, that now if there is a new addition, like Adobe software comes out with some great new capabilities, everybody gets it. So now everybody has that ability to move forward in the next stage in technology.
So have there, prior to implementing first JELA with Microsoft, had there been similar shared service type initiatives, or what prompted really adopting it at this moment, at this time? Was it sequestration and the budget cuts, or was this kind of in place prior to that?
It wasn't in place prior to it. I mean, we had done some joint work with other service components, but it wasn't to the extent of what we wanted to do. I mean, the economies of scale drive everything. It's actually cheaper for us to go and form a union across all the components because of the number of seats that are across all the components. Well, the Air Force has 500, 700,000 seats. You know, the Army has more than that, and we keep on adding on. So we can double the number of seats required, and therefore the cost gets cut down. And we've been finding that roughly we've cut costs roughly by 45% across the board of what we would have to pay if we had not gone that route.
Now, who can actually take advantage of a JELA? Can anybody use it? Who can actually take advantage of it as a vehicle?
Depends on the contract. Each contract, and this is the problem with the JELAs, every vendor has a different way of looking at the licensing model. So for one, we have standard across the board, here's what everybody has, and there's a license for everybody. And then there's the other model which says, I have that, but I also have individual software components that you can buy at a lower price. And the reason for all this is because when we develop a JELA, we are looking at the installed base of software that's already existing. And it takes a while to do that. It takes about 2 years to actually get that number. And we want to be able to take the installed base and use that as a basis for going forward, because that is what is eating our lunch right now in terms of money. And so we want to decrease that cost immediately. I mean, there's some benefits for across the board. If you're using lots of licenses like we did with Microsoft, we use lots of licenses because everybody has a desktop. But then there's other pieces of that that are not that frequently used, like project. Only a certain amount of people have project. So it's a way of looking at how you do the contract. Adobe has a different type of licensing agreement with us as well. And he can talk about that, but it's basically, yeah, we have some across the board, and then we have pockets of numbers of licenses that we can distribute accordingly for ourselves based upon what we want to do with them and how we're going to put them out to the field. And it really depends on the contract, depends on the vendor. Some vendors are very difficult to work with, and some are easier, but it depends on the costing licensing model they want to produce for us and how we can work with them to get a best price for everybody.
And what has been your experience in the Adobe realm?
Well, I think, and that's exactly spot on with the way the Adobe JELA works as well. The upside is that if anybody wants to join that, the way the contract is written, that anybody has the option and the opportunity to join. Anybody within the DoD realm can become a party to that contract once they go through DITCO and they go through the process. That's the upside. It's not really a downside, but the caveat is that they then need to comply with what's available on that contract. So in the case of Adobe, if it's not one of the enterprise tools or the creative tools, it's one of the offshoots, then that needs to be a separate transaction. So where they're going to get the most bang for the buck, and that's where the Adobe JELA comes into play, is those are the most broadly used product sets, just like the Microsoft. So it does make financial sense from a cost avoidance or an ROI perspective to join it, but you still have to weigh it as an agency whether it makes sense overall in what you're going to do.
How is that service selection process sorted out internally within DoD? How do you ultimately whittle down what are those essential purchases that need to be made and kind of weigh in on those competing needs across the agency?
How we determine what our JELA is going to be is what you're asking.
That's exactly what I'm asking.
We have to look at the install base. I mean, what we do is look at the install base and determine in that base who has the most products. And therefore, those are the ones that have the highest priority of getting a JELA or working with them to have a JELA. If there's not a very large installed base, then it's a question of how should I best procure it? And sometimes it's not best to procure it as an enterprise licensing agreement. sometimes if you're not going to use more than 10,000 copies of something, you may not want to do that. And that's the way we've been working right now. And that's why I said it takes a long time to do this, because all the components have to come in and tell us what their installed base is and what their future growth pattern is going to be. And a lot of times they take a while to figure that out.
We've talked a lot about some of the benefits, but broadly, what do you see, and this question's for all of you, what do you see as the main challenges of ultimately implementing and utilizing a JELA?
Well, I'll go first again. I got the challenges. The problem we have, and I'll do Adobe because they're nice guys. The problem we have is that they provide for us the capability to do e-forms, and we really like that capability. The problem is we have to spend the money to transition to that capability, and so even though the capability may be available and may be readily accessible to us, we still have to program the budget to support any transition plans that we have to do to the product line if it's not currently being utilized across a large swath. So we may have the e-forms in various places right now, and the growth pattern was to increase it. However, to do that, the plan has to be that we have to expend more money. And since money is a tight commodity, it becomes difficult unless you use the savings that you achieved from the JELA to actually plow that back in. And sometimes that's very difficult depending on the budget you're sitting in. What do you guys say?
Yeah, to add on to that, I think one of the unforeseen challenges a lot of times is after an agreement gets stood up, how it's communicated back to the constituents. In some of those, in some of the JELA contracts, you could have over 2 million users, and making sure that you have a discrete communication plan for each of the stakeholders, from the end users to the procurement personnel to all the way up the chain, is very important and often overlooked. And if your constituents don't understand how to use the contract, that could pose some issues for you.
Yeah, Joe, we found that out a lot. That if they don't have an idea that there's a JELA out there, they will not know how to use it nor how to actually get access to it. And that's one of the problems that we have right now, is that we may have it, but if we don't broadcast it enough and have procurement regulate as to who can buy what purchases, it's really hard to get the word out to do this.
Mm-hmm.
How do you ultimately spread awareness of its existence and educate the enterprise on how to utilize it?
It's a lot of meetings,
Meetings,
webcasts. I mean, you can write a policy directive that says to do that, but it really gets difficult. You have to get acquisition involved in doing that. And they have to be the stick that makes sure that when a purchase comes in, that if it should be on the JELA, they can redirect it to the JELA and tell the originator that they need to do some work to get that done. I mean, otherwise, remember the Air Force is pretty big and DoD is even bigger, that there's people doing things and it's very difficult to control everybody because they all have a mission to do and they're all trying to get it done effectively.
And I would add to that too. If you look at it as an engine process, there's the intake, there's the output. The intake, if somebody does try and purchase Adobe software that is covered, then they'll be redirected to CDW-G to make sure that they understand that they don't go through that normal process anymore. And this, by the way, is the new process. And since this is a beginning time frame, the Adobe JELA started in 2013, Microsoft was 2012. Over time, the word of mouth passes it, the front end loading of how you get your licenses passes it, and then on the back side is the procurement end of how are we going to pay for this renewal. And by the way, that's not the way we're going to do the renewal this time. So it really takes effect over a period of time, and we can see that the change and the awareness is starting, and it's slow on the uptake, but as it starts to grow, then more and more people realize how to use it, and that's where the cost savings come in.
What are some of the questions that you ultimately hear asked about it, or some of the common confusion that you might hear about what a JELA is and how to use it?
Well, I get the confusion as to what JELAs do we actually have and when we're going to have them, because the procurement train doesn't stop. So as we progress down the path, I mean, it's always a pressure point to say, when are you going to finish the JELA for this? Because I need to go out and get some software, and it may be part of this JELA. And so we get lots of issues of how fast can you actually move, and it's very difficult to move that fast, because not only you have to do the inventory, but you also have to do the negotiations with the vendor itself, and that takes a long time, because we of course want the lowest possible price for the most amount of software we could possibly get, and therefore there is some economies of scale as well as profit margins that the vendors want to maintain. So it's really difficult at times to figure out and also the question is, what is in the JELA? That's always one of my favorite ones. And we always get well, why didn't you include that in the JELA? And the answer usually is because you never told us you were using it, or you even thought about having it as part of the base. And we get that a lot too.
And I would add, there's two other confusions that we see, especially from the distribution aspect, is how do I pay for it, and where do I get it? So in the traditional model is someone would make a transaction, they would have the software delivered, and they would get their IT guys to install it. It doesn't work that way with the JELA, because they really need to pay the central authority, whether it's the Army or the Air Force. They're going to pay their G6 or whoever collects the funds in the aggregate, and they pay for it that way. They get the software through the distribution portal, whether it's through Microsoft or through Adobe and Carahsoft, and so there's a central way to get their software. So now they have a central way to pay and a central way to get it, and that's not the traditional model. So again, there's a learning curve involved, but over time those save monies in overhead, transactions, fees, understanding, communication. There's a benefit down the road, but with any growth there's growing pains, as some people say.
Yeah. And Joe, are there any common questions that you run into in your role at CDW-G that are common?
I think the big ones the panelists hit on already. What's on the JELA, and how do I get it, right? How do I get my software? Because as Greg pointed out, it's a completely different model than what a lot of folks are used to. A lot of folks are used to a CD that shows up in the mail, and they stick the CD in their computer and load the software. With the JELA, it's managed differently, so that's a bit of a learning curve that a lot of folks experience.
So I want to kind of transition to, now that we've kind of, I think, fully developed what it is, kind of talk about the strategy behind it and the structure of it specifically. So how are JELAs ultimately structured and acted on, and what's that process of purchasing through a JELA ultimately look like?
So I said every JELA is different. And we would love to have the same licensing model for all JELAs, so that's not the way corporations run. I think that if the structuring is the structuring is based on the corporations themselves. Adobe has their own structure, Microsoft, and we can go on. Red Hat, VMware, Oracle, they all have their own structuring issues of how they want to go forward with the JELA. And it's difficult for us in DoD because everyone is unique. And so we have to be able to look at everyone as a unique endeavor and look at it from the viewpoint of, okay, we may get a distribution point from Adobe a particular way, and we may have to pay for it a particular way, but then we go over here to this other one and we pay for it a different way, and we pay for it, how you accumulate the totals and everything else, and how we distribute it. So the problem we are going to have, and we're starting to have, we can see that, is we would like to have one central distribution point, and one way of paying, but I don't think it's going to happen because of the way that the costing models for all of the vendors are.
And I would add to that for a new JELA, to get on board with one of the existing ones, for example, Frank touched on it before, is somebody, let's say the Department of the Navy or DLA or somebody wanted to join that JELA. They would need to contact DITCO, and they're going to review what licenses they have, when all of those licenses expire, when that period of performance on that contract exists, and then do the calculation on when is the right time to jump in the pool. And so that is a transaction and a discussion that has to happen with DISA and DITCO in the case of the Adobe JELA to figure out what's the best time to begin, what products to add, and how that's going to change your cost model. So anybody can jump in, but they have to do that due diligence and that analysis up front to find out if it's the best fit.
Yeah, and just to add on to those points, I I think the best advice that I could give would be to assess what you use the most throughout the constituency of the different agencies that you're trying to set up, and keep it simple. Don't try to boil the ocean by adding in every last piece of software that you can find. Keep it simple, keep it focused, and stay focused, and add products in strategically throughout the course of your agreement that bring increased benefit.
So how have you each seen the rise of the JIE ultimately influence the push to use JELAs more widely?
I mean, JA looks at the enterprise as the enterprise, and therefore most corporations do this all the time. I mean, they have an agreement across the corporation for the vendors that they want the software for. And so this is just an evolution into DoD looking at it from the enterprise viewpoint as opposed to looking at it from each of the services viewpoint. Now, of course, you have differences in opinions in all the services of what should be in the JELA. But that's why we get together, and that's why it takes probably 2 years to actually get to an agreement point, us for a year to try to resolve what we really want to have, another year for negotiations.
And I think from a technology company perspective, you look at the different component parts of the JIE, and they seem to fit nicely with most technology companies' goals and objectives. Interoperability, collaboration, working partner with industry, secure document flow, secure the network from the source to the endpoint. And so from Adobe's perspective, there's a lot of those key points that you can tie into that definitely help the broadest set of customers and capabilities. And so it's just finding out which products best match those, and that seems to align with what's in the JELA. So whether it's secure collaboration through Connect or it's secure document encryption through Acrobat, all of those things come into play when you look at this broad-based JIE and what it wants to offer, and then what you have that can fit in.
And then just to add on to those points, I think one of the biggest areas that you can realize some true benefit throughout the JIE strategy is in leveraging best practices from different components, right? So different parts of the DoD. Army may have a best practice in the way that they utilize a certain piece of software that the Air Force may not be aware of, and vice versa. One of the driving factors behind doing a JELA is increased collaboration. So there's a lot of best practices that you can realize to increase efficiencies and save ultimately more money.
Yeah, and Joe, we do that. You'd be surprised that we actually look at, we actually look at what each of the services are doing in terms of what support they can actually provide for the JIE. And so the Air Force takes the lead in one thing, and the Army may take a lead in another thing. And therefore that drives, of course, what the JELA will eventually come out to be.
So how do JELAs fit into the overall DoD JIE strategy? And let's take an organization like DISA, for instance. How does this fit into their long-term strategy right now?
DISA is an arm of the DoD, the service arm. DITCO is the prime. I mean, we use DITCO for various contracts as well because of the contracting agent. It's easier to use DITCO for a DoD across-the-board procurement than it is to have the Air Force come out with a procurement that will function for all of DoD. It's just an easier way of getting the result that we want to do from an overall DoD viewpoint. We have Air Force contracts that are DoD available, but it's more difficult to get that through the procurement cycle than anything else. And so when we look at this support, this is basically supporting supposed to support all the components. And therefore there would be the logical choice for writing the JELA and being the contracting agent for the JELA.
So now we've talked a little bit now about some of the strategic components of JELA. I was wondering if any of you could share any examples or case studies of a JELA in action that you've observed directly.
Well, we can do Adobe. And we're saving about 45% across the 3-year span of time for the initial contract. Again, we're having an enterprise-wide. We use Acrobat. Everybody basically does use Acrobat across the board, but we are having difficulties with actually using some of the other products because of transition costs and because of lack of understanding of what's really in the JELA. I think we covered those, and we are having that exact experience with Adobe right now. In fact, we had a meeting with Adobe a couple weeks ago when they came in and told us, yes, you're not using our products enough. And we explained, we would love to, except we can't afford the transition costs right now. We're trying to figure out how to do this. And so we are in the same position. It's difficult at times to say, we can use everything that's on the JELA because of the cost involved. We just can't. We have to prioritize everything based upon the mission that we have to accomplish. And some things take priority over other things. Just the way it is.
Yeah, and I can tie into that a little bit especially from an Air Force example. Unlike the Army, they don't have a central way to push out Acrobat Pro, just because of its size and its bulk and what they have in place. The Air Force network, however, does have that capability. So they were able to push out 500,000-600,000 copies of Adobe Acrobat Pro. The benefit that provides is the GSA cost and the ELA cost. The GSA cost would have been several $100 million for that same product. It's about an 85% less cost. So there's an 85% cost avoidance over the full price. And they're able to push it all out so everybody could benefit from it. So that's just from the product perspective. From the productivity perspective, all the typical problems people will have of reformatting documents or finding ways to tie into data or building a new form, some of the studies show that there's about a 10 to 15% productivity gain by having a centralized tool that allows you to do all that, like Acrobat does. So you save $10,000 per person per year just in productivity costs. So Air Force, as an example, with 500,000 seats deployed, fully operational, the cost savings in productivity and just licenses is enormous. So the JELA paid off in just year one by having that in place. So from a case study, just strictly on cost, not even the challenges with implementation, there's a huge savings.
Do you have any other examples of where you've really seen the ROI demonstrated in other branches or other agencies within DoD?
Well, the Army has they're on a good track right now for fully implementing the other side of the coin, not the enterprise side, which I mentioned is somewhat of a challenge. They have the Creative Cloud side, which is all the single installation of all the Adobe Creative products. So again, even without full implementation, if you take in the cost comparison between what they would have paid and what they did pay, and they, by the way, have to use that tool because that's what their public affairs process, their information managers, and a number of other specialties already were going to buy those tools anyway. So now we've just given them a benefit by having a new set of capabilities, a new set of technologies at a greatly reduced cost. There's still challenges with distribution and installation, but that's going to be regardless of the platform. But they were already able to realize cost savings by using the JELA to implement their new software.
From the productivity standpoint that you mentioned before, how often do you find that's a leading question that folks are asking about? Are they leading with that, or is it more the immediate cost benefits and then the productivity benefits are residual?
I would think it's going to be residual. I mean, the first thing that you see is how much you pay, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Those are intangible costs that you can't truly realize. You can estimate them in studies and in kind of a common sense approach that, yes, if I'm going to have an easier time sharing documents and marking them up and managing them and building them, but no one truly has captured what those costs were to begin with. We just know how much we might avoid by having a more efficient process. So obviously the initial cost of the license is going to be the biggest benefit.
So there's like a shadow ROI likely going on.
Right.
So looking beyond just kind of the case study, kind of taking a look into the future, knowing that as a result of sequestration and budget cuts that things aren't necessarily going to get any easier in the budgetary world. Looking at, to you, what does JELA indicate about where procurement's headed over the next several years?
Well, there's a couple of things, and you got to be careful of a couple of things. Okay, it's not going to be the primary procurement activity for many things because remember, we're starting off with the installed base, and so you have to be careful here. I mean, if I would say that we're going to get a JELA that was going to take across all of DoD and wipe out competition for competing products, it would be a wrong thing to do. And so you're going to see that's why we start with the installed base. That's basically it. We're trying to help the installed base and some growth of that installed base. I mean, if we went to a particular vendor, and I won't mention anyone, and said, we want all your products and we're going to wipe out all your competitors, that would be, it'd be bad news for everybody. And so we have to keep the competitive landscape out there. And so there's the choice between, and this is where we get stuck with acquisition. We would like to standardize across with everything. However, when you do that, you avoid competition. So there has to be a balance between what the JELA is going to offer and what our other procurement vehicles are going to provide also. I mean, we have NetSense 2, which we use for procuring software. I mean, that's one of the vehicles that we have across the board, and in NetSense 2, it's supposed to be guaranteed lowest price to the government, which all of the DoD can also use. So at the same viewpoint, we like to be able to take our installed base and standardize it across the board because that's what we have already. But we don't want to go forward and say, well, we're just going to enlarge everything and take every product that's out there and have a JELA, because we would have to have a JELA for every vendor that there was to get equal competition at some point in time. And that's not going to happen. There's not enough time nor money to actually do that.
So with that in mind, what do you see are the future challenges for the expansion, if any expansion of JELA in the future?
Again, it's the install base. I mean, we're working right now with, I'd say, 5, 6 other companies for a JELA arrangement. That's about all that DoD can do at the same time, and it takes 2 years. So as we progress, what you're going to see is an influx. You're going to see new technologies come in that are not in the JELA, and different vendors and everything else that may increase the installed base for those new technologies. And then obviously the way to do this is take that installed base and then say, let's do a JELA for that new enlarged installed base of new technology. At the same time, usually JELAs are 3-year contracts. So at the end of 3 years, we can either change the JELA contract, change the mix of the things in there. For instance, if another great product came out that beat Acrobat, which is not going to happen, right?
Yes, sir.
We would, that next 3-year period, we'd say, well, forget that from the JELA, strike that, because our install base has now increased in such that it's this other product now. And so we get a JELA with the other product vendor. So I think you're going to see a mix of the way that DoD and everybody else is going to progress out, because things change rather rapidly. And even a 3-year contract, even though it has good scalability issues for efficiency, may be too long of a contract. The way things change. However, 3 years is a good way to start with, at least.
Greg and Joe, do you perceive similar issues for the future of JELA generally?
Want to take that one?
Well, I guess along the same lines with that 3-year period, I guess from my perspective, it's almost like the train is moving down the track. It's got 3 stations to go to, and at any point somebody can get on the train, but they're still going to have to get off at the last stop, right? So the contract has to continually be modified and adjusted, as Frank pointed out, to make sure that the train continues to move in the right direction. So it can have as many passengers as possible, but it still has to serve the same purpose and go the same direction.
So looking broadly and even beyond just JELA, what do you see as the future trends for procurement in the DoD space that can kind of help in a similar fashion leverage pooled buying power and taking into account installed bases across the enterprise? Are there similar tactics beyond JELA, or is this how the future is going to be going forward? What do you each see?
I see a combination of both. I mean, I can see us going forward with the JELA, which is the installed base, and progressing. But again, there has to be a way of injecting new technologies into the procurement cycle and how to go that. I mean, the NetSense 2 contract basically has some of those capabilities associated with it. But again, after a while, after a certain point that you reach when you have some large quantity of product line, something has to happen. I mean, you have to either have a different kind of agreement or a BAA or some other smaller enterprise level agreement that will allow you to purchase that at a cost savings price. So I think you're going to see a mix going back and forth. I don't think you're ever going to see one dominate over the other. What you're seeing right now is the install base taking over, which is fine because we're all trying to get to the same installed base, or this. Well, JA is trying to get to a standardization across the board. Now, standardization does not mean the same product. It means standardization. And so there's going to be lots of products that would correspond into the standardization so that when we have a Navy person running a piece of an Air Force capability, that they understand what it is in terms of same training was done for everybody. Remember, this is as the enterprise progresses, what you want to get to the point of is that it's ubiquitous who is actually doing the work. So to get that point, you have to have some standardization across the board because we want to have one training program, not a training program for what the Navy has to do and what training program the Army has to do. It has to be the same training program across the board. So when innovation comes in, it's spread throughout all of DoD, and the training program changes for everybody. And that's the way the enterprise has to run. So there has to be some mix of procurements to achieve that, whatever that mix may be.
Yeah. And just to add on to Frank's point, I think what we'll see is, I think through the JELAs, there's considerable cost savings, right? Especially in the front end of the purchasing cycle. I think what we'll see is the JELAs continue to evolve and make that on-ramp for new technology a part of the JELAs so that that piece of it is a lot easier for the government to execute on.
And so I want to kind of wrap things up here. And I want to know if there's just one thing that you would want folks who are watching to really get or take away from our conversation today about JELA generally and perhaps the procurement outlook for the future. What would that be?
Well, they're probably necessary in a large organization, without a doubt, because it provides some standardization and decreases the overall cost that you have to expend for that. So I think it's probably it's a necessary licensing agreement that we have to have. It's just a question of getting to the correct licensing agreement so that we all understand what we're getting and when we get it. And again, we always talk about the on and off ramps accordingly to support whatever new technology comes across.
Does it have to be just one thing?
No, you can have a few.
No, I guess a couple things come to mind. The biggest one, though, if we're looking from a procurement perspective, and what we've seen on the current JELA, is to make sure that the purchasers or the procurement personnel and the people that want the software and the organization overall understand how that funding flow is going to work. Because after the fact, trying to figure out how to centrally fund and centrally bill for thousands of licenses is not the time that you want to do it. So if you're going to join the JELA, you should understand the strategy and the approach before you begin, or at least have a game plan. The other one is just to keep in mind all of the new technologies that continue to either be requested or sought after or emerge on the scene, and then how do those fit into the existing process. Do they need to have more products added on to that agreement? Do they need a brand new agreement because they have a whole new portfolio of technologies that are out there? Again, it's something in the pre-planning process they need to take a deep look at of what their existing license base is and what they want to do, and then approach it that way. So I guess two things, right? The funding and the technology involved.
Okay.
And the point I would add to that is, I think there's a lot of excitement around the potential for cost savings around JELAs, and a lot of people focus on that piece of it. But the piece of advice I would give is, don't forget about, after you have the agreement, how you're going to use it, how you're going to do things like distribute software to your end users, how you're going to train folks so that they can use it and they know what's on your JELA agreement so that they can actually realize those benefits.
All right. Well, thank you, guys. I want to thank each of our speakers today, Frank, Greg, and Joe, for sharing their insights with all of us. I'd also like to thank everyone for watching with us out there, for your engagement today and your activity and questions that were submitted that we unfortunately didn't have time to get to. So I'd like to remind everyone that a link to the video of today's viewcast is going to be emailed to you. And once again, be sure to follow the conversation and feel free to contribute even after today's event using the hashtag Innovating Government IT. Again, that's all one word. So again, I just want to thank Frank, Greg, and Joe again for contributing their perspective and expertise on JELAs. And lastly, thanks to all of you who tuned in today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you very much.